All right, welcome back. Let's see where we are in our agenda. Right, so last week we had just finished introducing a little bit of AngularJS, right? And talked about Angular modules. We didn't get to directives. We'll do directives this week. And the topic for this week is AngularJS routing. Okay. Also, another thing that I'd like to cover when we get to directives is how to have AngularJS and jQuery play nice with one another. Okay. I mean, in general, you can use jQuery, but nothing that interferes with the model of AngularJS, right? If AngularJS is using an array or objects or has references to a data model, right? And that model is being used to render dynamic content on the page. jQuery should not be used to try to manipulate the DOM that AngularJS is also trying to manipulate, right? Because one has a completely different way of thinking about the DOM, right? Through these various layers of abstraction, whereas one of them is very low level and tries to manipulate the DOM, at the low level, right? So we'll show you when we get to directives later today, or maybe on Friday. We'll see how to have these two technologies talk to one another. Okay. All right. So let's talk about Angular routing. So let me illustrate this. Let me stop sharing. Basically, what we're going to do replace the navigation mechanism that we're very familiar with, right? Typically, when we navigate, we use anchors that specifically target another or refer to another page, right? So if you have page A, right, and you have page B and page C, right, and A references B and B references C, and then C maybe references back to A. In each one of them, right, from A here to reference B, you have reference b.html. Whatnot, yes? Right, that's how you typically navigate. And from B, same thing, right? A, href, c.html. Correct? Right. So each page is keenly aware of the navigation, right? And that's a problem if you ever want to manipulate or modify the navigation, right? That each page knows about where, depends on some other pages, right? So if A depends on A and B and depends on many other pages, right? And has to know that if you click on something, you navigate to these other pages. If you ever want to modify this navigation, right, it would be very, very difficult, right? Because you start having this spaghetti code everywhere, where the controlling the mechanism of navigation is spread over dozens, maybe hundreds of pages, right? If you want to modify the navigation, you have to go and visit and modify all the navigations. It's no. Before we go here, maybe I want to insert a page in between that that stops you and wants you to log in, right? Now you have to go back and modify. So there was an effort to create a design pattern that would allow us to handle this, right? Instead of having all these pages depend on each other, which you might have something like this, right? Each one depending like that, right? You have all this huge spaghetti and just the logic spread over hundreds of pages, right? Instead, we look for mechanisms where we can instead abstract this mechanism and centralize the maintenance, right? Where we can have a single place that knows where everything goes, right? And we can configure it easily, right? So instead of each page knowing where to go, right, they notify a central controller, says, hey, the user just clicked on this link. Where should I go? Well, actually, I'm not going anywhere, right? I'm just notifying the central controller. It might be that I stay in the same page, right? Or it might be that I navigate somewhere else. But now we have only a single place of maintenance, right? Or we can have maybe a config file or some CSV file or some database or some UI that would allow us to manipulate, if this happens, this is where you should go, right? So that's one of the main drives of the architectural change that we're going to make, right? Today we're going to introduce a mechanism that allows us to define this routing mechanism, right, using AngularJS's routing module. Okay, we're going to centralize this and configure it in a single place. Pages no longer will be dependent on knowing where they should navigate to, right? They're going to delegate this to a higher level abstraction. Make sense? All right, that's one of the main ideas. The second idea is that we navigate and we see things in our page, right? We see, content A, right? And later on we see content B, and so on and so forth. As we go, we're somewhat used to the fact that URL naturally, right, maps to what you're looking at, right? But before it was understood, right? You have a.html. It's understood that you would see the content for a.html, right? And if you have b.html, then you would see the content for b. So that's our natural understanding of how this should work. Okay, but we want to go a little bit beyond that. Okay, so this idea of the URL mapping to a particular content, again, an abstract way of thinking of that is that the URL should always represent a particular state of the application, right? Meaning the state of what you're looking at in the page should always be somehow encoded in the URL. Right? So that's a little bit higher level, right, of thinking about this, right? So okay, well, what do you mean by that? Well, if I have d.html, right, and d.html is the details of a particular movie, right? Well, if this is dynamic, and I see the content of D, is d.html enough to know to render the dynamics of the content of the particular movie that I want? Probably not. HTML, just the page itself is not enough, right? Because you have thousands and thousands of movies. You need to be able to distinguish between this page dynamically referring to one movie versus another movie, correct? So somehow we would like to encode in this URL, right? Right, if you have d.html, somehow we want to encode some ID, right? Maybe in the query we might encode the ID of the movie, 1, 2, 3, right? Now it uniquely identifies a particular movie, perhaps, right? This URL uniquely identifies the details of a particular movie that is identified by this ID. I should be able to grab this URL, email it to someone, right? And they click on that URL, and they should be able to see the same content that I see. Right? That was certainly true when we had static content, right? When we had static content, if I sent you a link to a.html or b.html, I would be pretty sure that you would see the same content I saw. But when we talk about dynamic content, right? It's not hard-coded and static in the page. This becomes even more important, right? Or how to encode this information, right? We have to maintain the same feature, right? The same basic idea that the URL uniquely encodes whatever state the page is in. Make sense? All right. All right. So yeah, this is important, right? Encoding the state of the application in the URL, right? Okay, so those two factors are going to drive a lot of what we're going to discuss today, right? Of using the routing mechanism, and obviously an idea that we've been toying around and mentioning for the last couple of weeks. These pages no longer are going to be full-blown pages. Instead, they're going to be snippets of code, right? Where this is going to be a header, this is going to be a sidebar, and this is going to be dynamically loaded. It'll be either A.html or B or C or D, depending as you navigate, right? Okay. So how are we going to achieve this? The way we're going to achieve this dynamic loading, right, is that we're going to use AngularJS to load a container web page, right? Which is typically going to just be index.html. Right, we're going to have a container index page, right? And then we're going to have this routing mechanism that, depending on what we click on the URL, right? Depending on the URL, is going to dynamically load A, B, C, or D, right? And going to fill in this blank. We're going to leave this blank. In index.html, we're just going to leave a placeholder, right? Empty, right? And then the routing mechanism is going to say, if they clicked on the link, on a hyperlink, on one of these hyperlinks here, right? On hash A or hash B or hash C, I will load A, B, or C. Okay? Hash. Why hash? So early on when HTML came out, right, browsers had a mechanism that will allow you to navigate within the same page. I don't know if you've used this, where you could use anchors. You can use anchors and you give an ID to the anchor, right? You know, and you might say, these are my references, so you get an anchor ID and then references, right? And then another one, these are my, this is my abstract. These are my collaborators, and you have different sections of the same HTML page. Yes. So you could break up a single page, very long page, in different sections, right? And you can name these using anchors: A, ID, reference, right? And then at the top, you might have a table of content, right? Well, you could have several href, and then here you could reference this section. You could say hash, right, ref. See that? So that if they click on that link, you never navigated away the page. What you did is that the whole page would scroll all the way to the bottom and would jump to the bottom of the screen. See that? So it's a table of content at the top that will allow you to navigate to various sections of the same page. Okay? Right? So the way the browser implements that is that it has a mechanism, right? It has a mechanism that listens for changes in the URL. HTTP : when you type and you press enter, right? You press enter, the URL is parsed by the browser and it's interpreted. Okay? So if you are at a page, your page, I don't know, i.html, say, right? And if you click and you go and you click on ref, what this becomes is i.html #ref. Okay? The hash is appended to the end of the URL, right? And the browser listens for these changes. It can listen for changes in the hash, right? It means that I'm not leaving the page. I'm just going to I'm going to look for this section in the page. I'm going to scroll down to that page. So it already has mechanisms, right, to listen for these changes in the hash. You understand? Okay. So JavaScript, you can use JavaScript to also listen for these hash changes. You can tell the browser, hey browser, notify me when the URL changes, right? If something changes, notify me, and I can do something, right? I can pop up an alert. I can do things, right? I can do any programmatic thing I want. And a lot of MVC design patterns, right, or MVC libraries such as AngularJS, what they do is they hijack this mechanism, right? They hijack the hash mechanism that was already built for the browser, okay? And it says, I'm going to build my entire navigation mechanism based on this hash mechanism. Because it does one thing. One of them is that it never navigates from the page. It stays in the same page, right? It can uniquely identify different sections. So I can uniquely map them to certain parts of the content, right? And another important thing is that the hash, right, this URL, these hashes are put into the history of the browsing, right? So just like you navigate between one page and another page, and you could use the back button or the forward button, right, to navigate through your history, the hash mechanism is also participates in that history, right? So for instance, if you put href and navigate to the bottom of the page, if you press back, it goes back to the previous URL with which we didn't have the hash. Yes? So the back button would navigate you to the top where you were. See that? That's very important. Because what it allows you to do is to have this new routing mechanism, right? To include the map, of the back button, right? Early on when we were creating these dynamic web pages, right, where the content was generated by the server, right? We had all these caveats and say, careful, don't press the back button, right? Use the navigation mechanisms in the content, not the browser. Don't use the browser's navigation mechanism. Instead, use the browsing mechanism that we give you, right? Because servers could not participate, right, in the same, they could not manipulate, right, or play a part in the history of the browser. Right? But now, because we're using JavaScript and we are running in the browser, and and Angular can participate in this history mechanism, the back button and the forward button are fully supported, right? And they behave like you would expect them, right? If you navigate through several content and you press the back button, you go to the previous ones. So very, very important. So routing, ngRoute is Angular's implementation of this navigation mechanism, right? That allows us to implement single page applications, right? What we're going to do is, instead of navigating to different sections of the page, what JavaScript is going to do is going to dynamically load pages, right? Fill in the blanks. Make sense? All right. So yeah, so it'll allow us to implement the single page applications, right? Fully supporting back buttons, forward buttons, back buttons navigation, and centralizing the navigation into a single place as opposed to spreading it over many different pages. Make sense? Okay. All right. So let's look at so this week's topic, AngularJS routing, and we'll talk about directives as well. Okay. All right, so we talked about ngClick. We did that, right? ngModel. Okay, ngRoute. Let's talk about ngRoute. So ngRoute is it's another module, right? We talked about how to create modules. Use .module method in Angular, right? And up to this point, we've been working with a single module, right? Our application module, right? The one that is declared in the ng app, correct? We're going to now load a separate module called the ngRoute. And the way we do that is by, when we declare when we declare our application, when we declare our own application, we put as a dependency, right, in the array of dependencies, we say ngRoute. Okay, and the naming convention is that, you know, ng is a well-known Angular namespace, right? That we all agree not to clobber, right? That ng is used for, you know, just like you know, in Java, you know, JavaX and Java.java, right? All those namespaces, or when it was Sun, it was com.sun, right? So it's a very well-known namespace that, you know, we know not to clobber. ng is a well-known namespace that Angular uses, right? I'm going to use my initials, right? When I code, I often use my initials, JGA, right? To understand that this is a module I wrote, right? It's a directive that I wrote, right? So yeah, there we go. This allows us to say that our application depends on the ngRoute, and ngRoute is implemented in a separate file. So let's inspect this. This is the page source. So this is the AngularJS module we've been using so far, right? There it is. It's we're loading it from CDN. ngRoute is a fairly complex module unto itself, right? And it has its own file, okay? And it's implemented in this file, angular-route.js. You know, angular-route.js. You can download it from Angular. Download. You can look at the modules. You see that one of the modules here is the AngularJS module. Angular route, sorry, there it is, Angular route. So you can download it and have a local copy, right, for development, or obviously you can link to it to a CDN. So there it is. So we have it there. We have the declaration of an application, of an ng app. We have the Bootstrap, the Angular. We have the declaration of our application, app.js. And notice we have 3 links here. We have 3 links. There's the simplest of ngRoute applications I could think of, right? It's three files, right? 3 templates that that we're going to denominate as home, profile, and admin. Okay, we don't know in what files they're implemented. Okay, and that's the whole point of a page not knowing about any other file. Okay, they just know that you want to go home. Where does that lead you? I have no idea. What page should display? It is not the prerogative of the view. The view should not know the navigational mechanism, right? We're centralizing that in a single controller, right? In a single configuration file, right? So also here's another link, profile. Again, it doesn't navigate anywhere. It doesn't know that it's implemented in a profile view HTML file, right? It doesn't know that. And then notice that we have this here, ngView. Right? ngView is our placeholder. It's our empty placeholder where these various other files are going to be loaded. The one for home, the one for profile, and the one for admin. Okay, they're going to be loaded dynamically into this ngView. Right? And these might be full-blown pages, right? They might have their own controllers, their own buttons and forms, and all sorts of data that reads from a server and dynamically renders. They could be whatever they want, right? Ours are very simple, right? It just has a header. The header just says home, profile, and admin. Again, I'm trying to make it as trivial as possible. Okay. Then in our app.js, here's our app.js. Our application doesn't do much, right? It only declares this to be the application, whiteboard app, right? And we're depending on this other module. So that module gets loaded. It needs to be declared after AngularJS, right? After you declare AngularJS, you can then declare AngularRoute, okay? And now we depend on it. And now we can configure the application. We can use the routing mechanism that is declared in this module ngRoute to configure the navigation. Right? This is our centralized navigation controller. Right? This is where we say if the user said that they want to go home, this is the page they're going to navigate to. It is no longer the page no longer knows where they should go. It is this centralized configuration. Right now we have it in the same file as the application and the configuration. It's in the same file, but typically these are two different files. Okay, one that declares the application, and another one that configures the application. Okay, so here's how it's configured. So the way it's configured is that this ngRoute module declares a service called route provider. Right, it's a service, just like $scope we've been using for the last week or so, right? $scope, what does it do? It maps views, right, template or variables in the with data in the controller, right? That's what $scope does, right? Route provider, again, very specific name. It has to be that name, okay? Does something else. It maps. It looks for the ng view, right? It looks for the ng view declared in that application. It says, okay, I have that div there. I have that div, and I have this. I'm gonna listen. I'm gonna listen for hash changes. I'm gonna listen for changes in the hash in the page, right? If the hash changes to nothing, meaning it's just nothing. There's nothing after the hash, right? I'm going to render the content in this snippet of code, home.html. If instead I see profile, meaning after the hash, right? After the hash, I see profile, I will render profile.html in that ng view, right? In that placeholder ng view, okay? If I see admin after the hash, then I will navigate to the admin page. You see that? Everybody okay? Right? And you can have like a default, right? If nothing else, right? If it's none of the above, then you can put a default. Where do you want to go? Right? It could be an error page, right? Or it could be to the default page, the home page, for instance, right? If I don't know where you want to go, I'll just put you in the home page. Make sense? All right. Okay.
So every route of your app should be listed over here.
Yes.
So if your application is full-fledged, then you will have as many routes as possible over here.
Yes. So typically you break. So the admin section typically is big enough that it's its own configuration file, right? That configures all the routes for admin, right? And then another separate configuration file for the regular users, right? So typically you might either break it up by feature or you might break it up by use cases, right? Use cases allow you to think about how to break up the navigation and the data model, all those exercises you're doing right now to think about wireframes and use cases and grouping this by feature, by user, right? It's an exercise to make you start thinking, how do I break this up, right? This could become fairly complex, right?
So if we break, and then we will have a different app over there.
No, it doesn't have to be a separate app. It can be a separate configuration, right? You can have, right now we only have one configuration, but you can have any number of these that apply under so you might have several under admin. So admin / users, admin / movies, admin / whatever, right? And each one, right, allows you to administer a particular domain object, right, or entity. Okay, and that you might have 10, 20 routes there, right? So it'd be a fairly complex config, right? So that would merit its own config file separately. And we'll see in a minute how to break it up. Okay.
And one more question.
Yes.
So when we go to profile.html.
Yes. Yeah. So if we go to profile, so actually profile, what does it look like, right? So we have home.html. Home is just this H2 and lorem ipsum. Right? If we go to, notice that it's a snippet of code. It's not a full-blown page. You see that? Right? It doesn't have HTML. It doesn't have head. It doesn't have body. Right? Who provides that? The index page provides that. Right? The container. Whoever is loading this page. Right? So the index page is an opportunity to load things that are common to all these pages. Right? Right? Maybe the navigation at the top. Maybe the right-hand side. Maybe a footer. Right? All things are in common with all these pages. You load them in the index page. Yes? And then the ngView allows you to load dynamically the actual content that changes as you navigate. Yes? Right? Then we have profile. Notice that the only thing that changed here is the head, right? So the paragraph hasn't changed. I should have changed the paragraph too to make it more distinct that it is indeed changing. And this is, then you have admin. Again, only the header is changing. Only the head 2 is changing. So when we click on this, right, and we click on profile admin, notice that it's changing the head, but also the bottom half is also being loaded dynamically. This paragraph, even though you don't see the change, it is dynamically being loaded, right? And what Angular does is that the content of home, the content of profile, the content of admin are not loaded a priori. Right, they're only loaded on demand, right? And once they're loaded, they're cached, right? Now I have it. I don't have to go fetch it again, right? It's cached locally on the browser. Right? So the home page, if it's not loaded yet, also all the JavaScript, everything that the CSS or anything that is related to that snippet of code, right? It's not loaded until you actually navigate to it, right? Until you actually press on profile. Notice what's happening at the top. Notice that I always stay in the same index page. See that? I never leave the index page, right? But we have this after the hash, it's changing, and Angular declares a listener, a JavaScript listener on the URL, and says, "Oh, hash changes. Notify me because I want to do stuff." Right? What does it do? It uses a configuration here, right, to implement a higher level of navigation that says, oh, if the hash is this, I'm going to show that. If the hash is this, I'm going to show this other thing. Everybody okay? All right. Okay, so
so is there any way we can stop a browser to cache?
Yes, you can manipulate the cache. Yes.
And if our final destination page, so that page is also dynamically generated, right? Before loading it, I want to make some changes. Suppose a profile.html, right?
Yeah.
So before loading that profile.html, I want to display my name. But so when that ngView loads, it will like follow the instruction on the ng controller to load it, or?
Yeah. So the page, everything all the cache goes away. Everything starts all over, right? Everything's thrown out, right? And everything's loaded dynamically again. So if you do make changes in your templates, right, and you reload the page, right, as opposed to navigating, as you navigate, you won't see your changes, right, because they're cached, right? You have to actually reload the page, right? Press on the browser and say, enter or press reload, right? And then everything gets reloaded, right? And you'll see your changes.
The profile.html here was static, right?
Yes.
But suppose my profile.html is not static.
Mm-hmm.
So it has to go to, suppose,
the server and get data.
Data for my profile. Then, but if we are only just catching that page and putting it over there, then how would that?
Yeah. So right now the content that's being loaded from profile or admin, these are all static content, right? Right now there's no model, there's no controller, right? And so what happens is that we'll see in a minute when we get to the config, we can specify a controller for that template, right? And that controller will be responsible for fetching data dynamically and providing it to the page, right? And the controller is instantiated only once, right? When you first come to the page. You come to the page, the controller is instantiated, and if you have an init function or some initialization, it will run only that once, right? It won't run again. So any changes that it might have done when it first loads, right? It will not do it again, right? Only things such as that, if you have ng clicks or event handlers that are interacting with you, those obviously take effect, right? If you say reload or whatever. But if you want the initialization to run again, you have to reload the page, to see your changes. Once you load them once, right? You presume that the page is done, right? It's running, and that's running in its normal conditions, right? We'll get to control when we get to controllers, and we'll see those kinds of issues. ngRoute location. So one of the things that we want to be able to do is implement some kind of hyperlinks that allow you to navigate across the various sections, right? And if you notice in the earlier example, the buttons had different colors, right? And you didn't know where you were unless you actually read the page and saw that I'm in home and profile and whatnot. Oftentimes we want that to be reflected in the hyperlink, right? We want certain hyperlinks to highlight, right, to tell us where, right, in the many places that we could be, where are we exactly, right, in the map. And this is one of the requirements in your assignments, right? That, right, on the left-hand side you have hyperlinks, yes? I think it's home, profile. At the top you have certain that as you navigate, you want to be able to highlight the various locations of where you are. Okay. Now the challenge is that the dynamic portion of home, of profile, those are loading dynamically, right? So they themselves don't have any navigation. Right? The navigation lives outside, right? Those are typically common features, right, that are loaded outside of the home, of the profile and whatnot, right? So they don't, in the example that you were implementing, the first static implementation, right? When you loaded to home, you hard-coded the highlight of the home. When you went to profile, you hard-coded the highlight of the profile. So the content was different. The actual content was different, right? Not here, right? In this implementation, you'll notice that the ng view is here. So the home profile admin is being loaded dynamically, right? But the navigation lives outside. You see that? The navigation lives outside. So how do we highlight? How do we highlight different things? Well, one way to do it is to use another service called the location service, right? The location service, which we'll see in a minute how it works. Basically what it does is that it tells you where are you, what is the URL, what is the current state of the application, right? Where am I? Okay, and we can look at that. We can ask the location for the current URL, and it'll tell us, right, where in the hash are we, right, at a high level. Right? It won't tell us what particular HTML file we're loading, but it'll tell us, out of all the states that you declare in the configuration file, right, this is where you are. We're in the home, we're in the profile, we're in the admin, right, at a higher level, right? So as we click here, notice that it says profile admin. It doesn't tell us profile.view.html, right? Right? Again, we're looking at this at a higher level, right? Of where are we logically, not physically. Yes? Right? So we could use that mechanism. We could use that mechanism with an additional Angular attribute called the ng class. Right? So ng class allows us to dynamically calculate what class do we want to show, right? By providing some logic, right? If you remember, BTM primary, right? It's a class that paints our buttons as with dark blue background, right? With a foreground of white. Okay, and what ng class allows you to do is as ng class, and what we could do is just give it a variable. We could give it a variable here, just a variable that is connected to a controller, and the controller can tell us what that variable is. Object. Here's a JSON object, right? It's a JSON object. that says it's a map, right, of name value pairs. The name here is the class that you want to use, and the value is an expression that gets evaluated that says if the location URL function, right, this function here, right, if it returns hash, class that I want you to use, right? If instead is /profile, then this is the class that I want you to use. Obviously, $sign location URL will only have one of these three values, not all at the same time, right? It'll be either slash or /profile or /admin. That means that only one of these will be true. So this, if you are in home or if you're in profile /profile, this is false. This is false. So this does not evaluate. So the class is not added to the hyperlink. You see that? If it's profile, then this is true. Then button primary is added to the class of the anchor. If it's /profile, this evaluates to false. So button primary is not added to the class of this button. You see that? So, and here I just put it here so that it renders so you could see what its actual value is, right? As I navigate, this is the value, right? So since it's equal to /profile, the profile button gets the button primary class, but not the others, right? You see that? So what this allows you to do is basically map this navigation to the URL. The URL tells me what I should highlight or not, right? So if I send this URL to someone, the correct button will be highlighted. You see that? As opposed to if I had this in an ngClick. That's another way of doing it, right? Another way of doing it is that if I put it in an ngClick on one of these, right? If I ngClick on the admin, then I can dynamically set a class on this, right? And turn it on. The problem is that if now that I'm an admin and I send this URL to someone else, right? Nobody will have clicked on that. I mean, the URL will be correct, right? But they have not actually clicked on the admin, right? So not necessarily the admin button will be highlighted. You see that? Right? No? So right now, it's the highlighting is based on this URL. Okay. Instead of having this logic of basing it on the URL, I would have had here an ngClick, and the ngClick sets a variable that then here it looks at it to turn on the button primary. Right, that would work as well, right? If I'm at a particular page and I start clicking around, ngClick, boom, it turns on home. ngClick, boom, turns on profile, right? ngClick, and so on and so forth. Right? I'm relying on the JavaScript, right, to listen for event handlers. If I go that way, instead of listening for the URL, the problem is that if I take this URL and send it to someone, and they click on that URL, right? They will see the admin, they're in the correct page, you see the right content, but because the ngClick was never fired by that person who's navigating, right? The hyperlink won't be highlighted, right? It won't be highlighted, right? Even though they're looking at the right page, but they say, wait, why none of these hyperlinks are highlighted, right? Because they were relying on somebody actually clicking on them, right? Instead, they just navigated to it. Make sense? So don't rely on event handlers. Obviously, you want to, as you ngClick and modify, blah, 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 and you want the content to change dynamically. But if you want to make sure that the data is represented, right? You should encode it in the URL. The URL should always have enough information, right, to reconstitute the page, right, at a particular time and space, time and moment, right? That if I send that to someone and they navigate it to it, they should see exactly what I see. You see that? There should be enough information in the URL to reconstruct the page, right? Obviously, it's whatever you negotiate, right? How much fidelity do you want this, right? It might be that maybe it's not as important to encode certain things, right? But again, if you want to be able to reconcile it, it should be in the URL. So that's important. So let's see the implementation. The implementation is that there is a controller, a nav controller, right? An outer nav controller, right? That takes up the entire. Here's nav. What does it close? Uh-oh. Does it close? Where?
On the top of new.
The top of. Oh, there it is. Thank you. Yeah. So section there of navigation, right? Itself has its own controller, and that controller, the only real thing that it does is that it just provides. So notice this is a variable, right? That's a variable. So presumably, who put that variable there? You know, the only way that that made it here is that somehow the $ scope made it available here, right? So if we look at the controller, let's go to the app, and here's the controller. So here's the module saying that we're declaring the dependency on ngRoute. It's the same exact navigation we had earlier. It hasn't changed. Right? The only thing is that we've added an additional controller at the bottom, right? And we're saying we're declaring nav controller, and the only thing that it's doing is that it's providing the $ location service, making it available to the scope so that the view can see it, right? And we keep the same naming, but you know we could have called it whatever we wanted, right? On the view, this has to be called $ location, right? These two variables have that specific name, right? Have that specific name. These specific names are used by the Angular framework to inject the variables as a function call, right? These functions are parsed. You know, the names of those variables are dynamically retrieved and says, oh, you're asking for the $ location. I will call you with these variables because you asked them. It's another design pattern that's very, very popular in server-side development. Right? It's called injection, right? Or auto wiring, right? Some people have in Java, C#, you have these mechanisms, right, where you use annotations, right? In Java, it says, oh, I want so-and-so service, right? And somehow somebody just passes it to you, right? And all of a sudden, this variable has scope. No, called you, you don't see that in any of the signatures, right? Nobody actually, but then you see that those variables are actually being injected, right? It's a very popular, very powerful design pattern in server-side development, and more and more JavaScript, you know, as JavaScript work becomes more and more complex and more sophisticated, we borrow ideas from proven ideas, right? Proven mature ideas from the server side. Okay, so injection. We'll come back to this a little later. What are the downsides of depending on the name of a variable, right? That has its own challenges, right? We'll come back to it a little later. But there we go. So we make the location available in the view, and now the view has that location. It's just displaying, just calling one of its methods URL, which tells you the current / after the hash of where you are. Okay? All right. Notice that this is not actually navigating anywhere, right? That is being the ngView is doing that, right? ngView is the one who's listening for these changes, right? And loading things dynamically. Any questions? That makes sense? Everybody okay? Yes.
So is it AngularJS just listen to in the config, and
yep.
Once you get a route to
yeah.
it,
yeah.
It just pull the HTML like it's these two HTML is in this.
Yeah, it does an AJAX call, just like we did $.ajax using jQuery. It does an AJAX call for that file, right? And so it goes back to the server and says, I need this HTML or profile.html or admin.html. Is dynamically asks the server for this ASCII file, this text file, right? it loads it, it parses it out, right? And it dynamically adds it to the DOM, right? And when it goes off to fetch another one, it removes what's there in the DOM, right? Anything inside of the ngView div, right? It removes anything in there, goes off and fetches another ASCII file, it parses it out, and it adds it to the DOM dynamically.
So the browser can parse it as if it's the same.
Yes, yeah. Using techniques that we've already been using, right? Using like adding things from the DOM, removing things from the DOM dynamically, right? Ajax, all these are techniques that we looked at already, right? So Angular, hides all this underneath, under lots and lots of layers of abstractions, right? And it abstracts it for you, saying, I'll give you a nice way to configure that by, this is the abstraction. This tells me if after the hash is this, I'm going to Ajax call to the server. I'm going to download this file. I'm going to dynamically add it to the DOM in the ngView div that you told me. Right? I'm going to inject it in there. And if I'm going to navigate away and go get something else, I will destroy everything that is in there. Right? In the DOM, I'll remove it from the DOM and fetch another file, and I will dynamically load that into the DOM. Okay? Maintaining the same page. I will never navigate away from the page. A single page application. Single page application. That's how Google Maps works, right? That's how Google, Gmail works, right? Most of today's modern applications, web applications, are single page applications. You never navigate away, unless it's a major section that you're going away or something, or some settings or some. But commonly you stay in the same page. Okay.
And the navigation bar is also loaded every time when we click on it, right?
It's loaded
every time, right?
What do you mean?
So it's like when I click on home, the
Yeah.
navigation bar gets loaded again when we click.
No, the navigation bar only gets loaded the first time, right? Navigation bar is here. It gets loaded with index.
Okay.
It only gets loaded with index, and then never again.
Okay, fine. So
this is what's going to be loaded dynamically, right?
So, but click on home.
Yeah.
Then ng class, right? It would what ng class would do is it would change the DOM. It would add button primary to the class attribute of the A, right?
Yes.
Fine. But when I click on profile, okay, then there should be Angular should do something like it should remove that button primary thing from the home.
It does.
Well.
Yep. Yeah, that's the controller. The controller is doing that, right? The controller is declaring this location URL, and it's saying, right? This is remember when we declare variables and things on the view, right? Everything has a watch, right? Every variable has an observer that is listening for changes in the model, right? Here, the model is basically this location URL, right? It's the state of location URL, and it changes every time there's a click, there's a whatever event happens, gets reevaluated. What is the URL now? Oh, it's this. So all of these update, right? They re-update to see which one is true, right? But nothing gets reloaded, right? The DOM is updated accordingly. Just last week we were adding things to the a new object to the array, right? And anybody who is listening to this array is notified, right? A new table row is added, right? It's added to the bottom, yes, right? But we never actually wrote any logic for that, right? We never wrote any logic, right? The notion is that there is this model, and whenever the state changes, everybody gets notified and everybody re-renders, right? Whenever data changes, everybody gets notified and re-updates. Okay?
So if you are an admin and I don't want profile button to display, then where do we come?
Yeah, we will get to that, but yes, I mean you could put all sorts of logic here, right? You could put all sorts of logic here. Is the user logged in, right? Does an admin, not only are they logged in, do they have an admin role? You can put all sorts of logic in this, right? Backed by server side, right? So in the front end, you hide things, show things depending on whatever logic you might have, right? But obviously, anything that you change in the view can always be defeated by malicious developers, right? So any logic that you put in the view, right? Any security measures that you might put in the view always have to be backed up by server-side logic, right? That if they are able to get around and go and manipulate the DOM, right, and get the admin link, right, so they can click on it, so they can go and start to admin, you always, the logic, the security logic is always backed by the server. It says, okay, wait, who's this? Who's trying to get into the admin? Are they, I know who they are. Maybe I know who they are, and I looked up their identity. Are they in the admin role? Are they actually allowed to do this? Even if they are able to navigate where they shouldn't, right? So in the view, what we'll do is we'll hide and show different links based on their security, based on their role, based on various logic, but also back it up with server-side security logic. Make sense? All right. All right. Let's go on to the next. Oops, did I close the wrong one? ngRoute controllers. So yeah, so here we have several links, right? And basically each template, we call these templates, these snippets of HTML that get loaded dynamically. We don't call them page anymore, right? Because a page kind of tells us that it's a full-blown page, right? That can live on its own, right? It's self-containing. Whereas over here, these are snippets of code, and what we're gonna do? Oh no, do that. What we want to do is that each page, right, the home, profile, admin, right? Each one that's being loaded, each one could be fairly sophisticated, right? They might go to the server and fetch data dynamically, and update what it's viewed, right? So we could configure. We can configure controllers that go along with each one of these snippets of code, these templates, right? So let's look at this is a whiteboard app. We go app. Notice that now this has been simplified. The only thing that this is doing is just declaring. It is only declaring the application. It is not actually implementing. It's not configuring anything. Instead, we move the configuration to a separate file, into a config file. Okay. We open that config file. Notice that we're loading the same module, the same exact module that was used to declare this application, right? But here it's a read operation as opposed to a declaration, right? We're fetching the module which has already been declared, right? Because it's in the lab, it was loaded earlier than us. App.js gets loaded first, and then config gets loaded second, right? So this one is reading the application, and then configuring the router. It's the same routing that we had earlier. It's the same exact router, but it's instead of just displaying the just giving us what the templates are, it also is declaring names of controllers that are associated to each view. Okay, and the way we're going to break it up now that we have 2 files per view as opposed to just 1 file per view, we have the home, right? Home, profile, and admin before, right? Just three files, right? But now each one is going to be accompanied by a dedicated controller, right? So now, since that was growing, it's doubling now. The size of our project is now doubling. We're going to create feature directories, right, or section directories, right, that are going to host both files, the view and the controller. Okay, and to distinguish them, we're going to the role in the application. We're going to put their role in the name of the file. So this will be home.view.html. So this is a view, and the controller will be implemented in the same directory, but it will be called home.controller.js. Okay. Later on, when this gets even bigger, and you not only have a front end, this is the front end, right? When we get to the server side, and this quadruples the size of our complexity, right? We're going to have to be able to distinguish between controllers that live in the front end in the client and controllers that live on the server, right? So we're going to revisit our naming convention, and we're going to start saying, okay, this is a view that lives on the client, right? It's dynamically rendered by Angular as opposed to a view that is dynamically rendered by the server, right? So we'll come back to this and say, okay, this is a home.view.client.html as opposed to a file that is rendered on the server, right, using EJS or JSP or things like that, right? It'll be home.view.server.jsp or PHP or EJS. We'll look at EJS towards the end of the course. Controllers as well, services, they might have a client component and a server component, all right? Right now, we're only looking at the client, and we're progressively making it more complex. Yes? All right. All right, so home controller is responsible for home view, and presumably home control is implemented in a home.control.js, right? Actually, I think we loaded it here. There it is. In home, there is a home.controller. In profile directory, we have a profile.controller. In admin, we have an admin controller. See that? Right? Each implementing each of these. Home by name. You list them by name here, by name. Profile and whatnot. Everybody okay? All right. So it means that when you navigate to home, before the HTML is displayed, right? The control is instantiated. So this controller gets instantiated. Notice that it's a controller that lives in its own file as opposed to in the app.js, right? Remember, our examples early on were simple enough that the controllers were declared and implemented in the same app.js, yes? But as our application becomes bigger and bigger, right, controllers will now have their own JavaScript, right? They merit their own JavaScript. Okay, so in here, it's a fairly trivial controller, right? It's using the same .controller. It's declaring the function, the constructor, and it's using scope to send data back to the front end. Home hello. So home hello. Home hello is it's home.view.html. It's there, right? It's home, and it's declaring this $sign placeholder for the controller to fill in, right? The same scoping rules apply. This controller only can talk to this view, right? So any variables here, right, have the same scope of that controller. Make sense? Notice that this does not render because I visited the page as a standalone page, right? Not inside of the framework, not inside of the ngView, not inside of the ngRoute as part of the application, right? Back in the application, home works just fine. Hello from controller. Yes? Notice that the page, right? If I look at the source of the page, notice that no longer is the page declaring that it has a particular controller, right? That's the way we were doing it, right? Remember earlier we were saying in the HTML over there. See that? We're no longer going to do that. Well, in a very limited sense, we are going to do a couple of those, right? But in general, we're not going to do that anymore. Okay, we're going to use the ngRoute mechanism and say this template, this controller, this template, this controller, this template, this controller. Right? Everybody okay? All right. What else? Yeah, so we call these directories feature folders. Break up the page, the application into features, as opposed to another popular way of breaking up applications, right, into constituent artifacts, is that you put all the controllers under a controller directory, all the views under views, all the services under service, all the models on the model directory, and that's okay if your application is small, right? If it's a small application, you just have a few controllers, a few services. You're breaking it up by type, right? Makes sense. But when you start having larger applications, it's better to break it up by feature or by section, okay, as opposed to by type, okay? All right. All right. Okay, so let's see. Look at another one. ngRepeat. I thought we did ngRepeat. Yeah, I think we already did that, right? Yeah. Yeah, we saw this, right? ngRepeat. We've been doing this, right? So let's go on to the next one. Okay, so this example uses a navigation mechanism, right? Using the tabs. Oh, interesting. Okay, I'll see what's wrong with that. So in the course, right? We can type in a course, MongoDB to add, and presumably declare. So the ng app, we load the scripts and the routing doesn't seem to work. What's it doing? Is it it just does. Oh, I understand. I remember now. Yeah. So right. So this introduces another a very important fact, right? Notice that the profile and the message, right? They might depend on what course you're. If I go into edit and I want to edit that particular course, if I click on it, wait a minute. Course 0. Edit. This is not working. Inspect. Source course overview list. This is a list. Update. Remove select. So that selects it. But edit doesn't work. Course overview. Example explained. All right. So what it's doing is that notice the top level, right? It says index slash, right? Index slash just displays the current list of courses. And the intent was that if I click on this, notice that it has a slash course slash 2. You see that? Right? If I go back and I select this one, it says slash course slash 0. You see that? So the intent of the example was that we like to the slash course presumably would navigate to another page, presumably called course overview, right? Course overview. But then the number here was kind of like a parameter, right? Oh well, which course do you want to see? You know, course number 0, course number 1, course number 2, right? If I want to edit a particular course, because this is somewhat getting into the one of the requirements in your assignment, where or even in your projects, right, where you have some kind of search or some kind of list of various entities, and then you want to navigate details of that entity, right? Maybe you're searching for a movie, you have a list of movies, you click on that particular movie, and you want to look at the details of that movie, right? So how would you do that? How would you have 2 pages talk to one another? Right? How would you have this list of courses? When I click on edit, navigate to courses, to course, which is course overview, and then use the index there to load a particular course. Okay, so how would you do that? So let's look at the source, page source, and we see that we have a configuration that says that if you're in the slash, I'm going to show the list of courses using the controller control list controller. And then if instead it's a slash course, right, followed by some number, right, I will navigate to course overview view, view.html. See that? So here I'm providing a URL pattern, right? I'm saying that if the URL pattern is course slash followed by something, right, followed by something, that's where I want to navigate. And notice that I can declare a placeholder called :index. You see that? :index. So that's not a hard-coded value, right? It could be anything, right? It could be, whatever, 1, 2, 3. Any value out here maps to that placeholder index. Now that it binds to index, I could retrieve it, right, as a parameter inside of my code and use it to do more things, right? If this were a movie and this would be movie / the IMDb, right? I could use that IMDb ID, right, to go fetch the details of that ID, of that movie. See that? You know, it's the same thing here. So the course list controller declares a list of courses, right? A default list of courses, and it sends this rendering using an ngRepeat, right? Everything else, I believe, we've worked through already, right? Several event handlers at the top is using the correct design pattern, right? Of putting all your event handlers at the top, declaring them, and then implementing them down below. I'd like to see that in your code as well, right? That you're declaring it correctly using good practices, right? Here it's selecting all this last week, right? So this should not be alien to you. Notice that this controller doesn't know anything about the navigation, right? If you're clicking here around, it only knows about, you know, being able to add and remove things from the array, right? So the other one, the course overview controller. Okay, so the only thing that it's doing is just navigating to that particular. Okay, it's not doing anything with the index. It's not doing anything with the index. It's just navigating and just saying hello. It says, yes, I was able to navigate here. That's weird. A better example might have been to actually display that. Maybe the next one does that. Let me see. Okay, I guess course 2 might do that. Okay, probably this is a more involved example. Okay, but this is for editing. This is more or less the same thing, right? Being able to edit using the dashboard, the dashboard templates on the left-hand side and the navigation on the top. Okay, so this is not new. Let's see. Next one, routing. Oops, that just crashed my server. Are you loading? Uh-oh. I think I moved a couple of things. Oh, man. You see? Routing 1, routing 2. Okay, profile. Users, scope, and repeat. Home, profile, users. So if I click on Alex, oh, okay. So this one's working. Yeah. So I go to users, right? And if I click on Charlie, it navigates to the profile page and tells me that it is Charlie. See that? If I go to users, right, and I click on Bob, notice that the data is Bob, right? If I go to users and I click on Alex, I notice that the back button and the forward button work. See that I can navigate between the two, and notice that the URL changes, right? And it shows a correct view based on what should be displayed, right? So that's very, very important that the navigation buttons, the native navigation. Let's see how this works, right? So we are in users, and I click on Alex, and I go here. And notice that what's happening here is that the profile I'm navigating passes this argument in the URL. See that? Right. So let's look at the configuration. So the configuration declares the various whens, right? The home, the users, and the profile. And profile will navigate to the profile if it has an ID at the end. See that? And if that's true, it will load profile.html and the profile controller. What's important here is what's happening to the profile controller. How is the profile controller retrieving the data, right? Okay, let's see. Let's load the profile controller. So the profile controller, the way it retrieves the ID, let's see the configuration, right? Notice the configuration. It says the route provider says that if I see this URL pattern /profile followed by something, that something will be bound, in the framework, will be bound to some variable ID. Okay? It actually, what it does, it creates of any parameters that it finds in the URL. Okay? These parameters, notice that they're part of the path. You see that? Right? They're referred to, generically, they're referred to as path parameters. Okay? As opposed to query parameters. Okay? So path parameters are those that are part of the path. So if you have profile, right, and then you have 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, okay, or you might have a student, 1, 2, 3, right? So I mean that retrieves that one student for that ID, yes. And then if I say course, that retrieves all the courses for that student, and this retrieves, if I have 2, 3, 4, I'm looking at that particular course, right, for that particular student. You see that? Okay. Now we seem to have a mapping between the path, right, and some data model in the back, and it's mapping of how our data model is related to one another. How students are related to courses, how courses are related to sections, sections related to whatever. Yes, right. We'll come back to this, but this is following a very popular way of organizing, navigation and data models, right? That the RESTful APIs use this quite a bit, right? To be able to, get to all the pieces of data using some hierarchy, right? Using paths. Anyway, so these over here are path parameters, okay, as opposed to query parameters. In query parameters, we might do something like this. Course, right? And then put a query at the end, a question mark, right? Where we might say user ID equal 1, 2, 3, ampersand course ID equal 2, 3, 4. Yes? Right? The path parameter is preferable, right? When you are navigating through a data model that has some hierarchy, right? Some objects are related to one another. Students are related to courses. Courses are related to whatever, and you might have several one-to-many, one-to-many, one-to-many. One entity to its children, and then to its children, and then to its children. So paths, because are perfect to navigate hierarchical data structures. Yes, right. Queries instead are somewhat more generic. Right? Queries are more useful when to provide filters, right? So for instance, you might look for all the students. This might give me, right? But I might have a query such as date of birth. I could put a date of birth here, right? Or the year that they were hired, or a particular salary. Those are filters, or something like a search. You're providing some kind of criteria, right? And searching, yes, as opposed to I want to navigate through the entire data structure. See that? You see the difference? Use one or the other. So use path parameters to navigate through hierarchical data structures, and you can use query strings to filter or narrow down, right, what type of users or data that you want. Make sense? Right? Different use. So anyway, so this ID here is as a path parameter. Okay? What the routing mechanism does is that it parses these path parameters and it creates a map. Right? And the map is the parameter name, which is ID, and its actual value. Right? And if you have several path parameters, it will be parsed. It will be parsed into there, and then from the controller, in the controller for that view, that controller will have access to that map of path parameters. Okay, so for instance, here we have the controller. Here's a profile controller. To access that map of path parameters, we use the route params service. Route params is part of the ngRoute module. Just like used to configure the routing. It's also used to retrieve the parameters in the path. Right. So, for instance, I can retrieve that ID right here. There it is. See that ID? Okay. And now that I have the ID, well, it's not really the ID. It's the index, right? It's an index. It's not really an ID. A better name for this might be index, right? Index of the student I clicked on, right? Okay. Now that I have the ID, what do I do? What do I do? Well, I have a problem, right? We have a problem in that there are two views. Here's a user view that has a list of users, right? That it uses my list of users, yes? But then in the profile view, somehow I have to have access to that list of users, yes? So that with my index, I can retrieve that one user, yes? Correct? So I kind of have, I would need this array of users in two places. I need it in the users controller, right? Because I need it so I can render it. But I also need it in the profile because I need to retrieve the object for that index. You see that? Share data amongst two controllers. You know, we could declare the array in some global variable, right? The array of all users, yes? And they can all read from this one array. That's one way. Okay, it's a very bad choice. But nevertheless, we do need this to have some share, some global nature, right? Everybody should be able to access it. So how do we do that? So there's a best practice of implementing it. And the best practice is to wrap common data, right, in a service. Data that is being accessed from all sorts of places, right, to put it in a single place that everybody can talk to it. And this is what this is, a user service. User service will the data and make it available to the other controllers. So here's two controllers, the profile controller and the user controller. They both use this user service. All right, here's the user service. Okay, and what the user service does here is it somewhat tries to it implements a design pattern that is very common in back-end development. Right, is that if you're manipulating a table, right? There's for those of you who have done 5200 and databases, right? Whenever you're manipulating an entity or a table or some piece of data, right? Typically, you don't want to use raw, SQL statements from, say, from Java or C# or PHP. Even though there's plenty of APIs that allow you to directly manipulate the SQL, right? Typically, you want to wrap this in some higher level abstraction, right? Usually using a design pattern such as the DAO, right? The data access object, right? And one of the things that we stress is that you should not have SQL statements all over the place in your Java code, right? Or C# code or whatever. Instead, you should wrap any access to the data through a data access object. Yes, provide an API, and then in there, inside of your data access object, you're free to use SQL and whatever data access, raw data access you might have. Yes, right. Same thing here. This is what the service here is doing. Okay, here is raw. It's a raw array. Eventually, it's not going to be a raw array, right? Eventually, it's going to be what? It's a I'm going to go Ajax fetch the data dynamically, right? I'm going to have it here, and then we provide an API, right? We provide a set of methods or functions that allow us to retrieve the data, in a consistent way. For instance, we provide two functions. One is find all users. Right? I want to retrieve all users. Who's using that? The admin, right? The admin is using that so they can render all the users, right? And then find user by ID. Yes? in 5200 we call these finders, right? Functions that allow us to retrieve data by some criteria. Yeah. Find all users has no criteria. I want all of it. But find user by ID, meaning I will retrieve the data using the criteria of ID, the ID that matches. Yes. I don't want all of them. It's just the one that matches this ID that I'm going to give you. So yes, of the functions, and then we implement functions. The functions here are very trivial, right? Deliberately so, right? Find all users, it just returns the array of users. Yes, and find user by ID is just uses the ID as an index into the array and returns that one object. Make sense? Right? Okay, so very important. So two things we learned about this particular example is, first, being able to parse the route, right? The parameters in the route, right? And once we have that, then use it as a parameter, right, into a service that can retrieve the data. So we to create the service, we use another function called the factory function. Okay, the factory function, which it follows a design pattern called the factory design pattern, right? Which basically it's a design pattern that hides the logic of creating instances of things, right? You create an instance of something. In this case, we're creating an instance of a user service, and it just provides you an instance of this object, right? So what it's doing here is that it's binding that instance of this function, right? Of creating an instance of this object to this service. This is a global name that can be seen from anybody, right? In this particular case, controllers are using it. If I go to the user controller, notice that in the declaration of the controller, not only is it asking for $scope, right? It's a service that I created. See that? So $scope is a service created by the framework, right? It's a service provided by the framework, but you are free to create any other services of your own. Right? So somebody wrote this service. We are writing this particular service, right? And it has an API. The API is that you can call find all users. What's that do? It retrieves that array of all the users, right? And what is the controller doing? The controller is providing that array to the front end. Okay. In the profile controller, the ID that is being parsed from the path parameter is being used to call the service find user by ID, right? To retrieve, right, that ID from the service, right, from the array, and retrieve that one object and provide it to the view. You see that? Okay. So yes. Like var app equal something? Yeah, you mean within a module? Inside of a module? Inside the app.js. Yeah, so in app.js, right, if you declare a variable app equal Angular something, that variable only has the scope of this function. So nobody else sees the app function. Okay? So instead, right? Instead, we use Angular.module to always retrieve the same app, right? So locally, you could do this, right? You could say var app equal Angular.module, and now in here, right, in this module, now you can say app.controller, app.directive, app.config, app.whatever, but only within this scope. Remember, any variables that we declare here are not visible outside. That was the whole point of wrapping this whole thing in an IFI. Yes? And to get around the IFI, we use the Angular.module to retrieve the app again. Right? We're reading the declaration. Okay? Where was I? Say controller. Right. So yeah. So we've seen the controllers now. The controllers retrieving data, accessing data, right, and eventually also manipulating the data, not within the controller. Not within the controller. The controller will not be manipulating the data. Okay. The controllers. I mean, we have been doing that, right? In the controller, we've been adding things to the array, removing things from the array. Yes. But that should not be the prerogative of the controller. Right, because that data shouldn't live in the controller, right? The controller should know where to fetch it, where to find it, and make it available to the view, but it should not be the one who manipulates the data. It should delegate to these services. These services that are accessible throughout the application can then provide this data to everybody, right? The controller only does the mapping between users, interface, right, and telling the service what should happen. Hey, service, they asked me to add a new user, delete a user, modify a user, find me a user, but the controller itself doesn't know how to do that. The controller is the glue between the view and the model, right, and the data that we're manipulating, right? It does not do the view. It doesn't decide what the view should see. It doesn't decide what the, it does provide the data that the view renders, right, but it does not tell it how to do that, right? The view decides how to do that. Anyway, let's go on to the next one. Routing, ngRoute, again, another one. Right, courses, edit, 0. I think this is more or less the same thing. So for instance, remove, edit, yeah, no, okay.
If I don't want to display the IDs in my URL, what's the other approach? So what pattern we should follow if I don't want that ID in my path?
Well, that's the only way where you can encode data, right? That you can then bookmark that URL or send that URL. You have to encode it somewhere, right?
So, but I want something similar to post. I don't want to display anything onto my URL, because if somebody finds that user ID, if somebody tries to somebody else's user number,
yeah,
and if I write that user number in my URL, then it will try to fetch. Okay, it will go to the server.
Yeah.
Even if my server has a validation, but it would try. But
yes, it would try.
I don't want any user to know what's my URL pattern is, so how we can hide our URL pattern.
Yeah, you can use a session, right, and cookies and things like that, where you can encrypt all that data, right? And even the URL, right, could be encrypted, right? You can have that ID, even if it's an ID of a user, that ID could be encrypted, right? That has only a meaning within the 10 or 20 minutes that the user has a session running, right? So that ID will be a throwaway token, right? That only has meaning within the scope or the session that the user is using, right? So that even if you send that over, it will mean nothing to anyone else unless they have that particular cookie and that encryption. Okay. So you have to consider what should I be able to share, right? And if that person, if indeed I want to send this over to someone, right? If they're not authenticated, if they're not logged in, if they don't know who they are, will this link even work, right? Right? If or depending given them, what kind of authority I might have given them as well, right? Are they in the same group, right? Maybe they are. Maybe I am allowing them to edit, right? So it is okay for them to see certain things or not, right? So those are other issues and security that we'll be talking about when we get to Passport.js and encryption and all that. But yes, you can encrypt this whole thing and store everything in the session, right? But you have the caveat of not being able to share the URL, right? Or the page from the encoding of the URL, right? But in general, we want to encode in the URL everything that we would need to reconstitute a page. Okay, all right. All right, I'm going to leave it here. If you could, go over these examples, and also the directives. some of these directives that I have here, so we can come back on Friday, and I'd like to do some live coding and implement something with what we know so far. Okay? All right. Thank you.